A pilot born into power, a CEO underestimated at every turn, a game of influence at 36,000 feet. But what happens when the one pulling the strings doesn't realize who's really in control? Betrayal, corruption, and a battle for the skies. This isn't just business. It's a fight to change the future. Stay with us, because what happens next will shock you. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The terminal of Los Verde International Airport buzzed with its usual symphony: rolling luggage wheels, distant boarding announcements, and the hushed murmurs of business travelers lost in their emails. The air carried a faint scent of roasted coffee and jet fuel, a combination that signified movement, ambition, and departures. Vivian Maynard walked with measured steps toward the VIP lounge, her presence commanding yet unassuming. She was dressed in an elegant navy blue suit, tailored but understated, the kind of attire that blended in without drawing unnecessary attention. A simple leather tote hung from her shoulder, and the only jewelry she wore was a delicate watch, a timepiece that had seen more than its fair share of battles in boardrooms. She had spent years working her way up, first as a flight attendant, then through relentless determination and strategic brilliance. She had climbed every rung of the corporate ladder, and now she sat at the very top. Horizon Skies Airways was hers, though most people in this airport had no idea. That was intentional. Vivian had always believed that power wasn't about being the loudest in the room. It was about knowing when to listen, when to observe, and when to strike. And today she was here to observe. "Good afternoon, Ms. Maynard," a young employee greeted her softly at the check-in counter. Vivian merely nodded, her expression composed, but her mind was already processing the subtle details. The way the young woman's eyes flickered with recognition before returning to a practiced neutrality. She knew who Vivian was, but had been trained not to react. A sign of good corporate discipline. But elsewhere, there were cracks. As she moved through the lounge, her sharp eyes caught moments of bias she had spent years trying to eliminate. A middle-aged white businessman, dressed in a crisp gray suit, was promptly served his drink, while a younger black woman in similar attire was left waiting at the counter. A flight attendant passed by a group of first-class passengers, offering warm smiles and pleasantries, but barely acknowledged a Latino man adjusting his tie near the window. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't even notice, but Vivian did. This wasn't just an issue with passengers. It was baked into the industry itself. The old ways still lurked beneath the polished veneer of professionalism, and Horizon Skies, despite her efforts, was not immune. She settled into a quiet corner, crossing her legs as she scrolled through her phone. A notification appeared, an internal email thread regarding new pilot training policies. Her name was on it, but so was another. Gerald Ashford. She felt her jaw tighten slightly. Gerald Ashford, former CEO of Horizon Skies, had once ruled the company as if it were his personal empire. Even after stepping down, his influence lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. He was still on the board, still maneuvering, still ensuring that his legacy remained intact, and of course, still pushing his own agenda. Vivian tapped the email open, scanning the details. The language was carefully crafted, neutral on the surface, but the intent was clear. The new pilot training program would continue to favor candidates from specific elite aviation schools, maintaining a cycle of exclusivity that kept the industry locked in the past. Her lips pressed together. It was a power play, and she had no doubt whose fingerprints were all over it. Gerald was testing her. A quiet sigh escaped her lips as she closed the email and leaned back against the cushioned seat. She had fought too hard to reach this position. She wasn't about to let old systems dictate the future, not while she still had a say in it, but she needed to see things for herself. Vivian reached for her boarding pass. She had booked a seat in first class on Flight 274 to New York, not as a CEO, not as a board member, but as an ordinary passenger. Because sometimes the only way to truly see the cracks in a foundation was to step back and watch where it started to break. She took a slow breath, her fingers tapping idly against the armrest as she gazed out the large airport windows. A jet taxied onto the runway, its engines roaring as it prepared for takeoff. A storm was coming, and she was walking straight into the eye of it. Vivian approached the gate for Flight 274, blending into the sea of well-dressed travelers. The air carried the sterile chill of conditioned air, tinged with the faint scent of disinfectant and coffee. The boarding process was underway, a well-rehearsed dance of priority passengers moving forward, while others lingered impatiently. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a Horizon Skies uniform stood near the cockpit door, chatting with a flight attendant. His stance was casual, confident, the kind of confidence that came from knowing he belonged. Cole Ashford. She recognized him instantly. His father's influence was written all over his career. He was young, charming in a practiced way, and had inherited not just Gerald Ashford's connections, but also his arrogance. Cole wasn't a bad pilot, on paper at least. But in a world where others had to fight for their place, he had never once questioned whether he deserved his. As she approached the first-class entrance, she caught the flicker of his gaze. It was brief, just a glance before he resumed his conversation. But something in the way his eyes swept past her told her everything. She wasn't supposed to be here. "Good evening," a flight attendant greeted her as she handed over her boarding pass. There was no recognition, no hesitation, just the professional warmth expected in first class. Vivian stepped inside, taking in the polished elegance of the cabin. Cream-colored leather seats, dimmed overhead lighting, and the gentle murmur of passengers settling in. A man in a sharp navy suit adjusted his cufflinks beside her, his Rolex catching the light. Across the aisle, a woman scrolled through emails, barely looking up as a flight attendant set a glass of champagne on her tray table. Vivian found her seat and eased into it, her movements unhurried. She wasn't here to disrupt. Not yet. She was here to observe. Minutes later, the doors closed, and the captain's voice came over the speakers, steady, authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain, Cole Ashford. We're looking at a smooth flight tonight from Los Verdes to New York. Estimated time en route, 5 hours and 10 minutes. We'll be cruising at 36,000 feet, expecting favorable conditions throughout the trip. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight with Horizon Skies." Vivian closed her eyes briefly, exhaling through her nose. The irony of it wasn't lost on her. The aircraft taxied onto the runway, the deep rumble of the engines growing beneath them. She felt the familiar push against her seat as they ascended, the city lights shrinking below. The flight had begun. As the seatbelt sign dimmed, the service began. The flight attendants moved efficiently, their practiced smiles in place. A glass of wine was placed on the tray beside her, along with a neatly folded napkin, and that's when she felt it, the shift, a delay. She glanced toward the aisle, watching as a flight attendant hesitated near the row ahead of her, a subtle but noticeable pause before continuing. Then a voice, low, measured, but laced with something she recognized all too well. "Excuse me, miss," a man's voice drawled, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Vivian turned her head slightly. A man across the aisle leaned back in his seat, regarding the flight attendant with a casual smirk. He was in his mid-50s, dressed in an expensive charcoal gray suit, his silver hair neatly combed. His presence exuded the kind of wealth that wasn't just about money but about power, the kind that shaped boardrooms and dictated policies. Preston Langley. She had seen his name before. Chief Executive Officer of a luxury hotel chain, a frequent collaborator with airlines, including Horizon Skies, and now apparently an instigator. "I believe this young lady here might be in the wrong seat," he said smoothly, gesturing toward Vivian. "Or perhaps there was a mix-up in the reservation system?" A few heads turned. Vivian met his gaze, unwavering. "That's an interesting assumption," she replied, her voice steady. Langley smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No offense, of course. It's just, well, we don't see many new faces in first class. I fly this route often, and I like to keep track of things." The flight attendant hesitated, glancing between them, clearly unsure how to proceed. Vivian took her time reaching for her wine glass, her fingers deliberate as she lifted it. She took a slow sip before setting it back down. "Let me ease your concerns, Mr. Langley," she said evenly. "I assure you, I belong exactly where I am." There was a pause, a beat of silence where the air itself seemed to tighten. Then, "Is there a problem here?" Cole Ashford's voice. Vivian didn't turn immediately. She felt the shift in attention, the way the moment became something more than just a casual exchange. Cole stepped forward, his expression neutral but his posture stiff. He glanced at Langley first, then at Vivian, and there it was, the flicker of something beneath his calm facade. Not concern, not curiosity, recognition. He knew, but he didn't know. "Everything's fine, Captain," Langley said, waving a dismissive hand. "Just a misunderstanding. I was merely curious about our new guest." Cole exhaled through his nose, his gaze lingering on Vivian for a second longer than necessary before he nodded. "Enjoy the flight," he said, before turning on his heel and heading back toward the cockpit. Langley watched him go, then turned back to Vivian, his smirk returning. "Well," he said, picking up his own glass, "I suppose we'll see, won't we?" Vivian simply smiled, tilting her head slightly. "Yes," she said, "I suppose we will." She picked up her glass again, but this time she didn't sip. Instead, she let the stem rest between her fingers, feeling the weight of the moment settle. She had just been given a glimpse of what lay ahead, and it was exactly what she had come for. The flight continued its journey across the night sky, the gentle hum of the engines providing a comforting backdrop to the tension that had suddenly charged the cabin. The glow from the overhead lights reflected off the smooth surfaces of the seats, casting soft shadows that shifted with the plane's movement. Vivian's gaze lingered on the man across the aisle, Preston Langley, who had returned to his seat, still watching her with an air of barely concealed interest. She could feel the weight of his eyes even as he pretended to resume his conversation with the man beside him. His words, while polite, didn't fool her. He had already decided that she was someone to be watched. Her mind replayed the exchange, each word lingering like a note that hadn't quite settled into a melody. There had been something off about Langley's demeanor, something deliberate in the way he had approached her. But it wasn't just that. It was the way he had orchestrated the situation, just enough to cast doubt in the air. A subtle game, one she wasn't sure whether she should play along with. She shifted in her seat, adjusting the fabric of her jacket. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft ding of the seatbelt sign as the aircraft began its initial descent into New York. The lights of the city twinkled below, a sprawling network of roads, buildings, and life stretching out beneath them like a sea of possibility. She wasn't here just for the view, though. She was here to watch the system from within, to see where it cracked and where it held together. Her years of effort had led her to this moment. Yet she had always known that the real fight would begin now, in the quiet moments when no one was looking. As the seatbelt sign went off, the flight attendants began their routine, offering final drinks, checking on passengers, and ensuring everyone was comfortable for the landing. Vivian watched them move, each gesture practiced, each word measured. And yet, underneath the surface, she could sense the deep divide, the silent struggle between those who were in control and those who were merely following orders. Vivian's attention shifted back to Cole Ashford as he reappeared from the cockpit. He walked down the aisle with a casual swagger, exchanging pleasantries with passengers along the way. As he neared her, he paused, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Everything all right, Ms. Maynard?" he asked, his voice smooth, too smooth. Vivian looked up at him, meeting his gaze with a calm that masked the tension she could feel building inside. "Everything is fine, Captain. Just enjoying the flight," she replied, her tone even, a mirror of the professionalism she had long perfected. There it was again, the flicker of recognition. A silent understanding passed between them, but it was fleeting, as if neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge it. She could tell that Cole was already assessing her, mentally calculating what role she would play in his world. He nodded slightly, then glanced back down the aisle. "I'll let you get back to your rest then." Vivian's gaze followed him for a moment before she turned back to the window. Below them, the lights of New York shimmered, the city alive with possibilities. But as she sat there, a sense of unease settled into her bones. This was more than a simple flight. This was a carefully constructed game, and Vivian had just stepped into its center. The plane touched down with a smooth, practiced ease, the wheels gently kissing the runway as they slowed. The familiar sound of the engines adjusting for landing was almost calming. Almost. But the weight of the situation hung heavy in the air. The passengers began to stir as the plane taxied toward the gate. Vivian slowly gathered her belongings, her mind still swirling with the events that had unfolded. Her attention was momentarily diverted when she noticed a young man across the aisle, a recent college graduate by the looks of him, muttering to his phone, clearly frustrated. The glare of the screen reflected in his glasses as he typed, his fingers moving quickly. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft, but just loud enough for him to hear. The young man looked up, startled by the question. He seemed to hesitate for a moment before responding. "Yeah, I was just trying to get some work done. It's been a long flight." Vivian nodded, offering a polite smile. "I can imagine. Long flights tend to drain you." He returned the smile, though there was still an edge of frustration in his expression. "Yeah, but I guess it's worth it. New York's always worth the hassle." Vivian's smile deepened slightly, not from amusement, but from understanding. The city was a place where people came to prove themselves, to reinvent, to rise above, or to fail trying. She could feel the pulse of it even now, beneath the surface, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The plane finally came to a stop, and the seatbelt sign flickered off. Vivian stood, smoothing out her jacket as she made her way toward the front of the plane. She passed Cole again, who was busy reviewing his flight logs, his attention momentarily fixed on the documents in his hands. But as she walked by, he looked up and gave her another one of those measured smiles. "Take care, Miss Maynard. I hope you enjoy your time in New York." She paused for a split second, meeting his gaze directly before answering. "I plan to. You too, Captain." As she exited the plane, a subtle wave of relief washed over her. It was just the beginning, but she could already feel the storm brewing. What she had seen today was only a hint of what lay beneath the polished surface of Horizon Skies. And now she would be at the center of it, watching carefully, waiting for the right moment to strike. The game had begun, and Vivian Maynard wasn't about to lose. The terminal at JFK was alive with movement, a ceaseless tide of travelers weaving through gates. Luggage in tow, conversations blending into an indistinct hum. Vivian stepped onto the polished floor with the same quiet confidence she carried everywhere, her senses alert as she moved past businessmen, weary parents, and flight crews making their way to their next destination. She had spent years in airports, first as a flight attendant, then as an executive, and now as the unseen force at the helm of Horizon Skies Airways. The familiarity of it all was comforting in its own way, but comfort wasn't what she was here for. Her phone vibrated. She pulled it from her pocket and glanced at the screen. Ava Henderson. Vivian swiped to answer. "Tell me." "We have a problem." Ava's voice was calm, but there was a sharpness beneath it, urgency wrapped in professionalism. "You were right to suspect something was off. I found something buried in the pilot training records." Vivian stopped near a row of high-backed chairs, her back to the wall, watching the flow of people around her. "How bad?" Ava hesitated, then exhaled. "Very bad." There was a brief silence before Ava continued. "The selection process for the new pilot training program, it's rigged. Everything looks clean on paper, but if you dig deeper, there's a pattern. The same aviation schools, the same backgrounds, and guess whose name is stamped on most of the approvals?" Vivian felt her jaw tighten. "Gerald Ashford." "And Cole," Ava confirmed. "He's been personally involved in pushing through certain candidates while quietly rejecting others. Mostly people from non-traditional backgrounds. Women, minorities, pilots trained outside the preferred network." Vivian closed her eyes briefly, letting the information settle. It wasn't surprising, not really, but it was worse than she had expected. She opened her eyes, her gaze sharpening. "I need documentation, real proof. If we're going to take this apart, we need something they can't talk their way out of." "I'm already on it," Ava said. "But there's more. I found something else. An email chain between Gerald and Preston Langley." Vivian turned away from the crowd, lowering her voice. "What does Langley have to do with this? He's not just a bystander. He's got financial interests in Horizon Skies training academies. If we overhaul the program, it doesn't just affect Gerald. It costs Langley millions." Vivian exhaled slowly. "So that's why he was on that flight. He wasn't just traveling, Ava said. He was watching and testing you. Vivian had already known it, had felt it in the weight of his gaze, the casual way he had tried to undermine her on that flight. But now she understood his real game. He wasn't just supporting Gerald, he was protecting his own empire. Ava hesitated again. You need to be careful. They're not going to go down quietly. Vivian's fingers tapped idly against the handle of her tote bag. Neither am I. She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket, her mind already running through her next steps. There was no point in confronting them outright. Not yet. She needed more. Something solid, something they couldn't spin. And that meant getting closer. She took a slow breath and turned toward the private car service waiting area. She had a meeting to attend, one that Gerald Ashford didn't know was coming. As she stepped outside, the cool New York air wrapped around her, crisp and sharp. The city was alive, pulsing with opportunity and danger in equal measure. The cracks in horizon skies were deeper than she had realized. But cracks could be widened, and when they were, everything would come crashing down. The sleek black town car glided through the streets of Manhattan, weaving between yellow taxis and hurried pedestrians. The towering skyline of steel and glass loomed above as Vivian sat in the back seat, her fingers tracing absent patterns against the leather armrest. The city felt different tonight, alive in a way that mirrored her own anticipation. She wasn't just here to observe anymore. She was here to move. The car slowed in front of a glass-walled skyscraper in Midtown, the headquarters of Horizon Skies Airways East Coast operations. Vivian stepped out, smoothing the lapels of her jacket before making her way inside. The executive boardroom was on the top floor, a space designed for dominance. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the city lights, while the long mahogany table at the center of the room was polished to a perfect sheen. Seated at the head of the table was Gerald Ashford, his silver hair neatly combed, his navy blue suit impeccable. He didn't look surprised to see her. Vivian. He gestured to the seat across from him, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I wasn't expecting you until next week. Vivian lowered herself into the chair, crossing her legs smoothly. I don't like waiting, Gerald chuckled, leaning back slightly. So I've heard. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, a careful balance of power that neither wanted to tip too soon. I assume you've seen the latest training program reports, he said casually, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. Good numbers. The board is pleased. Vivian met his gaze unfazed. Good numbers mean nothing if the process is flawed. Gerald's smile barely faltered. Flawed? That's a strong word. It's the right word. Vivian pulled a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. I had a look at our pilot training approvals. A little too neat, don't you think? Gerald opened the folder, skimming through the papers inside. His expression remained neutral, but Vivian didn't miss the way his fingers stiffened slightly against the pages. Cole's been signing off on recruits, she continued, and somehow only a very specific type of applicant makes it through. Same schools, same backgrounds. She tilted her head. Funny how that works. Gerald closed the folder, exhaling through his nose. I won't deny that we prefer a certain pedigree in our pilots. It's not favoritism, Vivian. It's maintaining standards. Standards, she repeated, leaning forward. Is that what we're calling it now? Gerald set the folder aside and took a sip of his drink, studying her. You want to change everything overnight, the way we recruit, the way we train, the way we operate. But let me remind you, this company didn't become what it is by catering to ideals over results. Vivian held his gaze unshaken. And let me remind you, Horizon Skies didn't become what it is by clinging to the past. For the first time, the mask of amusement slipped from Gerald's face. You think you're in control here, he said quietly. Vivian smiled, but there was steel beneath it. I know I am. A silence stretched between them, a silent battle of wills. Then Gerald leaned back, folding his hands in front of him. Be careful, Vivian. His voice was smooth, but there was a warning beneath it. You might not like what happens when you push too hard. Vivian didn't blink. Neither will you. She stood, smoothing the front of her jacket. I'll see you at the next board meeting. Unless, of course, you decide to save us both the trouble and fix this mess before then. Gerald watched her go, his fingers tightening subtly around his glass. As Vivian stepped back into the elevator, she let out a slow breath. The game had begun, and she had just made the first move. The elevator ride down from the boardroom was silent, the soft hum of machinery the only sound as the floors ticked past. Vivian kept her posture composed, but her mind was already moving 3 steps ahead. Gerald Ashford would not take this lightly. He had ruled Horizon Skies for too long to let anyone, especially her, disrupt the foundation he had carefully built. As the doors slid open, the chilled night air met her like a quiet warning. She stepped onto the curb, signaling for her driver, but before she could enter the car, a voice cut through the night. "Ms. Maynard." She turned, already expecting who it would be. Preston Langley stood a few feet away, his hands in the pockets of his dark overcoat, looking every bit the powerful businessman that he was. But tonight, there was something sharper in his stance, something less polished. Vivian exhaled, offering him a glance. "Mr. Langley." He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I heard you had an interesting conversation upstairs." She tilted her head slightly, observing him. "News travels fast." "I make it a habit to keep informed," he said smoothly, taking a step closer. "And I must say, I admire your confidence. It takes a certain kind of woman to walk into a room full of men like Gerald and tell them they're wrong." Vivian's lips curved, but it wasn't amusement. "It doesn't take confidence, Mr. Langley. It takes knowing exactly what's at stake." Preston's smile widened. "Ah, and what exactly do you think is at stake here?" She met his gaze, unwavering. "More than just money, but I imagine that's all you're concerned with." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You wound me, Vivian. I'm concerned about many things. Stability, for one. Longevity. The future of this industry." She folded her arms, waiting. "But mostly," he continued, "I'm concerned about what happens when people forget their place." There it was, the first real warning. Vivian's expression remained unreadable. "People like me, you mean?" Preston sighed, as if disappointed. "You see, that's the problem with disruptors. You come in thinking you can rewrite the rules overnight. But this industry, it's built on tradition, legacy. You can't change that just because you want to." Vivian let the words settle before responding, her voice even. "You're right, Mr. Langley. I can't change tradition overnight." She stepped closer, lowering her voice just slightly. "But I can expose what's wrong with it." For the first time, she saw something flicker behind his confident facade. A crack. It was small, but it was there. Preston exhaled, as if shaking off whatever had just crossed his mind, and straightened his shoulders. "Well, I suppose we'll see how far you get." Vivian nodded. "Yes, we will." With that, she turned and stepped into her waiting car, leaving him standing on the curb. As the city lights blurred past the window, she tapped her fingers lightly against her knee. She had seen it, even if he had tried to hide it. He was worried, and that meant she was exactly where she needed to be. But the real fight was only beginning. The city blurred past as Vivian's car weaved through the streets, the muted glow of neon signs casting brief flashes of color across the leather interior. She sat in silence, fingers resting lightly on her phone, contemplating the next move. Gerald Ashford had shown his hand. Preston Langley had made his threat clear. What came next would not be subtle. Her phone vibrated. Avenue Vivian answered. "Tell me you have something." Ava's voice was clipped, urgent. "We have a problem." Vivian straightened slightly. "Go on." "I kept digging into the pilot recruitment records. It's worse than we thought." Vivian frowned. "How much worse?" Ava hesitated before speaking. "It's not just biased recruitment, it's fraud. There are pilots on the roster who don't meet FAA qualifications, but they were approved anyway." Vivian's fingers tightened around the phone. "You're sure?" "Positive," Ava said. "I pulled internal communications. Cole Ashford personally signed off on at least 3 of them. And the worst part? These pilots are already flying." Vivian inhaled slowly, letting the weight of it settle. This wasn't just favoritism or corporate politics. This was a negligence at a level that could destroy the company if it ever came to light. "What's the paper trail look like?" she asked. "Messy but traceable," Ava replied. "They tried to cover it up, but there are emails, altered training records, discrepancies in flight hours. Enough to prove that someone, probably Gerald, was orchestrating the whole thing. Vivian's mind was already calculating. If this information leaked, the FAA would launch a full-scale investigation. Horizon Skies would be in chaos, and she would be blamed for it. This isn't just a bad business practice, Ava continued. It's a scandal waiting to explode. If we don't control the narrative, someone else will. Vivian exhaled slowly. Then we control it. Ava was quiet for a moment. Gerald won't let this go without a fight. Vivian's voice was calm, steady. Neither will I. She ended the call and stared out the window, the lights of the city reflecting in her eyes. The cracks in Horizon Skies weren't just growing, they were about to shatter. And when they did, she would make sure she was the one holding the pieces. The morning air was crisp as Vivian stepped into the executive offices of Horizon Skies Airways in Manhattan. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the corridors, and the quiet hum of office chatter barely reached her ears. She moved with purpose, her heels tapping against the polished marble floors as she entered her private office. Ava was already there, seated across from Vivian's desk, laptop open, a deep frown etched across her face. I went deeper into the records last night, Ava began, wasting no time. It's not just 3 pilots. There are at least a dozen. Vivian set her bag down and folded her arms. All of them pushed through by Cole? Ava nodded. And signed off by Gerald with Langley's financial backing. She turned her laptop screen toward Vivian, revealing a series of documents. They've been manipulating training records for years. Some of these pilots have barely met minimum requirements, but their files were altered to look spotless. Vivian's eyes scanned the reports. It was worse than negligence. This was criminal. If any of these pilots made a mistake mid-flight, it wouldn't just be a corporate scandal. It would be lives lost. She inhaled slowly, then met Ava's gaze. We need to be careful. If Gerald and Langley sense we have this, they'll try to bury it. Ava nodded. That's why I made a copy and stored it off-site. We have leverage. Vivian allowed herself a small, approving smile. Good, now we use it. She reached for her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. After a few rings, a deep voice answered. Vivian Maynard. That's a name I wasn't expecting to see on my screen. Vivian leaned back in her chair. Hello, Frank. Still with the FAA? Frank Carter chuckled. Still making headaches for people like you. Then you'll love this, Vivian said smoothly. I have information that might interest you. Pilot fraud, altered records, and a CEO who thinks he's above regulation. There was silence on the other end, then a slow exhale. You realize what you're saying? I do, Vivian said, and I have the proof. Frank's tone shifted. Meet me in 2 hours. We do this my way. The line went dead. Ava raised an eyebrow. That sounded promising. Vivian stood, grabbing her coat. It wasn't a promise, it was a warning. He knows what this means. As she moved toward the door, Ava hesitated. Vivian, what if Gerald sees this coming? Vivian glanced back, her expression unreadable. Then he'll make his move. And that was exactly what she wanted, because the only way to take down a man like Gerald Ashford was to let him think he still had control, until the very last moment. Vivian arrived at a discreet cafe tucked away in the quieter streets of Lower Manhattan, the kind of place where business deals were whispered over black coffee and where no one asked questions if you sat in the corner for too long. She spotted Frank Carter immediately, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, the sharp lines of his face carved by years of chasing down corruption in aviation. He didn't stand as she approached, but his dark eyes tracked her every step. Vivian, he greeted, motioning to the seat across from him. Still playing in dangerous waters, I see. Vivian sat, setting her bag down carefully. You know me, Frank. I never liked calm seas. He smirked, but the amusement didn't last. He reached for his coffee, his fingers tapping idly against the ceramic. I reviewed what you sent. If this is real, and I have no doubt that it is, this could bring down Horizon Skies. The FAA will have no choice but to open an investigation. Vivian nodded, her expression unreadable. That's why I brought it to you first. I need this handled carefully. Frank studied her. You're not just worried about the company. You're worried about the fallout. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she traced a finger along the edge of the coffee cup in front of her. I've spent too many years fixing what's broken, Frank. If this goes public the wrong way, I lose control of the narrative. And that means Gerald wins. Frank exhaled slowly. So what do you want from me? Vivian leaned forward slightly. I need you to give Gerald just enough room to think he can cover this up. If he believes he still has the power to manipulate the system, he'll show his hand. Frank let out a quiet chuckle. You want me to bait him? I want you to watch, Vivian corrected. Let him make a move. Let him try to bury this. Then when he's deep enough, we pull the floor out from under him. Frank tapped a finger against the table, considering. That's risky. If he catches wind of what you're doing, he won't just try to outmaneuver you, he'll destroy you. Vivian's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. He's already trying. The older man studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, I'll play along, but you better hope he takes the bait. Vivian picked up her coffee, taking a measured sip. Oh, he will. She placed the cup down with deliberate care. Because I'm about to give him exactly what he wants. 2 hours later, Horizon Sky's executive offices. Gerald Ashford sat in his corner office, staring at the report in front of him. The FAA had requested additional documentation regarding the latest round of pilot approvals. It wasn't a formal investigation, yet, but it was close enough. His jaw tensed. Someone was pulling strings, and he had a very good idea who. A slow smirk spread across his lips as he leaned back in his chair. He had underestimated Vivian Maynard. That was his mistake, but it was one he would not make again. He reached for his phone and dialed a number. The voice on the other end answered quickly. Do it. No further instructions were needed. The call ended. Gerald exhaled through his nose, his gaze drifting toward the Manhattan skyline. If Vivian thought she was the only one setting traps, she was about to be very disappointed. The executive floor of Horizon Sky's airways hummed with a quiet tension. Vivian could feel it the moment she stepped out of the elevator. The polished hallways, the subtle hum of hushed conversations, everything felt normal, yet off. Ava was waiting for her outside the office, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. We have a problem. Vivian kept walking. Of course we do. What is it this time? Ava matched her pace. Gerald moved faster than we expected. This morning, 3 board members suddenly reversed their positions on the recruitment overhaul. They're now backing Gerald's legacy training system. Vivian didn't slow down. They wouldn't flip unless they had a reason. What did he promise them? Ava exhaled sharply. Money, influence, probably both. But that's not all. Someone leaked a report to the press claiming you pushed unqualified pilots through the program. That made Vivian stop. She turned her head slightly, eyes narrowing. And who exactly are these unqualified pilots? Ava's jaw tightened. The minority hires, the ones you've been advocating for. A slow, simmering anger curled in Vivian's stomach. It was so predictable. If Gerald couldn't silence her, he'd turn the conversation against her, make it seem like she was the one endangering the company. Who ran the story? Vivian asked, her voice unnervingly calm. The Wall Street Tribune, Ava said, and it's already spreading. Gerald's not just defending his system, he's making you the problem. Vivian turned back toward her office, pushing open the heavy doors with controlled force. The room was bathed in natural light, but at that moment, it felt colder than usual. She set her bag down carefully before looking at Ava. We're going to make him regret that. Ava nodded. What's the move? Vivian sat, fingers tapping against the desk. Gerald just gave me an opening. He's making this a fight about qualifications, about standards. She leaned forward slightly. So we prove that his standards have been rigged all along. Ava's eyes flickered with understanding. You want to leak the fraudulent pilot records? Vivian shook her head. Not yet. Ava frowned. Why not? Vivian smirked. Because if we drop the proof now, he'll pivot. He'll spin a new narrative, distance himself from Cole, blame it on mismanagement. She leaned back. We need him to dig his own grave first. Ava exhaled. So we wait? No, Vivian said smoothly. We bait him. Ava's lips parted slightly before she nodded, her admiration evident. You want him to double down? Vivian's smirk deepened. And when he does, we take everything. The trap had been set. Now they just had to wait for Gerald to step right into it. The sun dipped lower over Manhattan as Vivian sat in her office, the golden light casting long shadows across the polished desk. The city outside buzzed with its usual energy, but inside Horizon Sky's Airways headquarters, the tension was thick enough to cut. She was waiting. Ava had left an hour ago, tasked with making sure their next move was executed flawlessly. For now, it was a game of patience, letting Gerald believe he had won just long enough for him to fall further into his own trap. Her phone vibrated. A message from Frank Carter. "He's making his move. Sending you a link." Vivian clicked the link, and a live news broadcast filled her screen. This breaking development in the Horizon Skies controversy, where sources have revealed that CEO Vivian Maynard has personally pushed through unqualified pilot recruits under the guise of diversity reform. The move has sparked backlash from industry veterans, with some calling it reckless and a risk to passenger safety. Vivian leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. Gerald had done exactly what she expected, escalating the attack, ensuring the story gained maximum exposure. The words passenger safety were an intentional play, a fear tactic, and now he had overplayed his hand. Her desk phone rang. She answered smoothly. "Yes?" Ava's voice was crisp. "It's done. We got what we needed." Vivian smiled slightly. "And the reaction?" "He thinks he's in control," Ava said. "Gerald's calling an emergency board meeting tomorrow. He's confident he has the votes to force you out." Vivian exhaled slowly, her pulse steady. "Perfect." Ava hesitated. "Are you sure you want to wait until the meeting? We could release the records now." "No," Vivian said simply. "Not yet." Ava sighed. "You really want to watch him walk into this, don't you?" Vivian allowed herself a small chuckle. "I want him to celebrate before he realizes he's already lost." She ended the call and turned back to the screen, where analysts debated whether her leadership would survive the controversy. Tomorrow, Gerald Ashford would stand before the board, certain of his victory. And then she would tear his world apart. The boardroom was silent except for the faint hum of the city beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. 12 members sat around the long mahogany table, their expressions a mix of calculated neutrality and barely concealed curiosity. They were here for a show, Gerald Ashford's final play. Vivian took her seat at the head of the table, her movements smooth, deliberate. Across from her, Gerald sat with his usual confidence, his fingers tapping idly against the armrest of his chair. He thought he had already won. The doors opened and Cole Ashford strode in, his expression schooled into something resembling indifference. He took a seat next to his father, but there was something in the way his shoulders squared, a false bravado masking uncertainty. Vivian allowed the silence to stretch before speaking. "I assume this is an official meeting," she said, her voice calm. Gerald folded his hands. "Yes. Given the recent allegations, the board has a duty to discuss whether your leadership is still in the best interest of Horizon Skies." Vivian nodded slightly as if considering. "By allegations, you mean the conveniently timed reports claiming I approved unqualified pilots." A murmur rippled through the room, but Gerald simply smiled. "The board deserves transparency. The public deserves transparency." Vivian met his gaze unshaken. "I agree. So let's be transparent." She tapped her phone once. Ava's voice came over the speaker system, clear and unwavering. "Good morning, everyone. I've just sent each of you a report detailing the actual fraudulent pilot approvals over the past 5 years." A few board members reached for their tablets. The room shifted. The air thickened. Gerald's smirk faded. Vivian leaned back, watching him. "Seems your concerns about unqualified pilots were valid, Gerald. Except, as you'll see, the pilots in question weren't mine. They were yours." Cole's face paled slightly. Vivian continued, her voice steady. "FAA records, training logs, internal emails, every single fraudulent approval, every name personally signed off by either you or your son." The silence was suffocating. A board member cleared his throat. "Gerald, is this true?" Gerald's jaw clenched. "This is a misrepresentation. I had no involvement in falsifying records." Vivian tilted her head. "That's interesting, Considering I have an email from you to the Chief of Flight Operations, explicitly instructing them to approve Cole's recommendations without oversight, Ava's voice came through again. I also took the liberty of forwarding these documents to our FAA contact. I imagine they'll have a few questions. Cole's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly. You set us up. Vivian looked up at him, unimpressed. No, Cole. You set yourself up. Gerald's face darkened. You can't prove intent. Vivian smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I don't have to. The FAA doesn't need intent to shut down every pilot approved under your system until a full investigation is complete. One of the longest-serving board members, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, sighed. This company cannot afford that kind of scandal. Another member nodded. Gerald, this is catastrophic. For the first time, Gerald looked shaken. His grip tightened around the arms of his chair. He had walked into this room believing himself untouchable, and now he was watching his empire burn. Vivian let the weight of the moment settle before delivering the final blow. This board can decide to clean house now, or wait until the FAA does it for us. A pause. A decision unspoken but understood. Gerald Ashford had lost, and Vivian Maynard, she had just won everything. The boardroom was silent, except for the faint sound of shifting papers and uneasy glances exchanged across the table. Gerald Ashford sat stiffly in his chair, his knuckles white against the polished wood surface. He wasn't used to losing, but today there was no escaping it. Vivian watched him carefully, allowing the weight of his downfall to settle. The board members had seen the evidence. They knew the damage was already done. Now it was only a matter of whether they would cut him loose before the entire company suffered the consequences. Cole shifted beside his father, his confidence visibly unraveling. This is insane. We built this airline. We made it what it is today. Vivian arched a brow. And you almost destroyed it with your arrogance. His jaw tightened. You don't understand how this industry works. It's not about fairness. It's about experience, about trust. She leaned forward, her voice low but unwavering. Trust? You think passengers trust an airline that allows unqualified pilots to fly commercial aircraft? You think the public will side with a family who manipulated the system for personal gain? Gerald finally spoke, his voice measured but tense. You're making a mistake, Vivian. She tilted her head slightly. No, you made the mistake when you thought I wouldn't fight back. A heavy silence followed. The woman with silver hair, one of the longest-serving board members, tapped her fingers against the table. Gerald, you've put this company in a very difficult position. Another board member cleared his throat. If this goes public, the fallout will be disastrous. Our investors will pull out. The FAA investigation alone could cripple operations. Vivian leaned back in her chair, watching as the realization dawned on them. Gerald Ashford was no longer an asset. He was a liability. Cole turned to his father, panic creeping into his voice. Dad, say something. But Gerald knew. He saw the writing on the wall. The board wasn't going to back him this time. Finally, after a long pause, Gerald exhaled, his gaze settling on Vivian. You think this is over? She didn't blink. For you? Yes. A moment passed. Then Gerald stood, buttoning his jacket with slow, deliberate movements. This company won't survive without me. Vivian smiled faintly. Watch me prove you wrong. Without another word, Gerald turned and strode toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the tense silence. Cole hesitated, his hands balled into fists, before following after his father. As the doors shut behind them, the board let out a collective breath. The silver-haired woman turned to Vivian. What's your next move? Vivian straightened, her expression calm but resolute. We repair the damage. We rebuild the system. The right way. A slow nod, then another. One by one, the board members exchanged glances and realigned themselves. Vivian Maynard had done the impossible. She hadn't just survived the coup. She had taken control. The boardroom was still buzzing in the aftermath of Gerald Ashford's exit. Some members were speaking in hushed tones, others staring at the reports in front of them, as if truly processing the gravity of the situation for the first time. Vivian remained seated at the head of the table, composed, her hands folded neatly on the polished wood. She had won the battle, But the war to rebuild Horizon Skies into what it should be had only just begun. Ava leaned toward her, voice low. They're rattled. They weren't expecting this much proof. Vivian gave the faintest nod. Good. That means they'll listen. She turned her gaze toward the silver-haired woman who had spoken earlier. Margaret Vance, one of the longest-serving members of the board, and one of the few who still held true influence. Vivian met her eyes. We have two choices. We either wait for the FAA to dictate the future of this company, or we take action now, on our terms. Margaret tapped a manicured nail against the armrest of her chair, considering. What exactly are you proposing? Vivian inhaled slowly, gathering the words she had been waiting to say. A full audit of our pilot training program. Every hire over the last 5 years will be reviewed, transparently with independent oversight. A murmur rippled through the room. Some nodded in approval. Others, particularly the ones who had aligned with Gerald in the past, shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a man named Richard Hale, frowned. That could expose more than we're prepared for. Investors will panic. Vivian didn't waver. Investors will panic if we sit back and let the FAA take over. Right now, we have a chance to show leadership, to control the damage before it controls us. Another board member, a younger man with sharp eyes, leaned forward. And what about Langley? He's still got deep financial ties to our training academies. Vivian's lips pressed together. Langley will be handled, one step at a time. Margaret exhaled, then nodded once. I agree with Vivian. The industry is watching. We need to set the standard, not be made an example of. One by one, the others followed, some reluctantly, some more eager. Vivian had expected resistance. What she hadn't expected was how quickly they accepted her authority. It was official. She wasn't just holding on to power. She was leading. Margaret leaned forward. So what's next? Vivian straightened. We announce the audit publicly. We rebuild trust from the ground up. And we shut out anyone who thinks they can manipulate this company for personal gain. A silence stretched. And then, one by one, the board members nodded. The old Horizon Skies was dead, and Vivian Maynard was about to reshape the industry. The press conference was set for noon. The air outside Horizon Skies Airways headquarters was thick with anticipation. Reporters lined up, cameras rolling, microphones ready. The world was watching. Vivian stood behind the sleek podium, the company's emblem gleaming under the studio lights. Behind her, a row of executives and board members sat in silence, their expressions unreadable. Ava stood just to the side, her presence a steadying force. Vivian cleared her throat and began. As of today, Horizon Skies Airways is launching a full independent audit of our pilot training and hiring processes, she said, her voice steady and unwavering. We have identified discrepancies in past approvals that do not meet our company's standards or federal regulations. We are taking immediate action to correct these failures. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Reporters exchanged glances, fingers moving rapidly over keyboards. Vivian continued. We have also initiated personnel changes at the highest levels to ensure that Horizon Skies upholds the integrity and safety that our passengers deserve. She didn't say Gerald Ashford's name. She didn't have to. A journalist near the front raised his hand. Miss Maynard, what do you say to those who claim your push for diversity led to hiring unqualified pilots? Vivian met his gaze directly. That claim is categorically false. The issue was never about diversity. It was about a system designed to keep certain people in power while overlooking others who deserved a fair shot. That system has ended. A beat of silence. Then another question. Does this mean legal action against former CEO Gerald Ashford? Vivian exhaled, then answered carefully. There are ongoing investigations that I cannot comment on at this time. What I can say is that Horizon Skies will fully cooperate with the FAA, and any individuals found responsible for misconduct will be held accountable. A buzz went through the crowd. She had just confirmed what everyone suspected. Gerald was in trouble. As she finished answering questions, her phone vibrated. A message from Frank Carter. Feds are moving in. Gerald and Langley won't walk away from this. Vivian slipped the phone back into her pocket, her pulse steady. Gerald had spent his entire career believing he was untouchable. Now the walls were closing in. She stepped away from the podium as the press conference ended. The cameras flashed, reporters shouted follow-up questions, but she ignored them. Ava fell into step beside her. "It's over." Vivian exhaled, the weight of the last few weeks settling. Almost, because power didn't just disappear. It shifted, and she would make sure it shifted in the right direction. The sky over Manhattan was a brilliant shade of gold and deep blue as Vivian stood in her office, looking out over the city. The weight of the past few months still lingered in the air, but tonight there was something different, something lighter. It was done. Gerald Ashford had been formally removed from the company. The FAA investigation had uncovered enough evidence to ensure that he and Cole would never work in aviation again. As for Preston Langley, his financial dealings with the training academies had come under intense scrutiny. His name was now synonymous with corruption, and his empire was crumbling under the weight of its own greed. Vivian had won, but victory didn't mean stopping. Ava walked in, holding a folder. "Final approvals for the pilot recruitment overhaul," she said. "We're opening applications next month." Vivian turned, taking the folder from her. "Good." She flipped through the pages, scanning the details. For the first time in the company's history, true meritocracy would exist. Ava hesitated, then smirked. "So, what's next? You just reshaped the future of an entire airline? Maybe take a vacation?" Vivian let out a quiet chuckle. "Tempting, but I was just offered a seat on an aviation reform panel in D.C. Ava's brows lifted. "Wait, you're rewriting the rules for the entire industry now?" Vivian met her gaze, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "Why stop at one company?" Ava let out a breath, shaking her head. "You really don't know how to slow down, do you?" Vivian set the folder down, looking back toward the city. "I never liked flying on autopilot." Outside, the skyline stretched infinitely before her, the glow of lights painting a path toward something new. Horizon skies had changed, but this was only the beginning. The industry had been built for men like Gerald Ashford. Now it was time to change the sky itself, and Vivian Maynard was just getting started. Power isn't just about who holds the highest title, it's about who dares to change the rules. Vivian Maynard didn't just fight for a position, she fought to break a system designed to keep people like her out. And in doing so, she proved that true leadership isn't about legacy, it's about impact. So tell us, in a world built to favor the few, what would you do to level the playing field? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, because we have more stories of power, justice, and the fight for change coming your way.